The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop in front of the weathered wooden station, and Catherine Monroe tumbled out onto the muddy street of Salvation Creek, Texas. Her carefully packed traveling dress, now splattered with brown muck from the wheels that had kicked up every puddle between San Antonio and this remote cattle town in the spring of 1876. She landed on her hands and knees, her carpetbag spilling open beside her, and for one terrible moment she considered climbing right back into that miserable coach and heading straight back to Boston. Broken engagement and empty bank account be damned. "You all right there, miss?" The voice came from above her, deep and warm like honey. And when Catherine looked up through the strands of auburn hair that had escaped her once neat bun, she found herself staring into the bluest eyes she had ever seen. The man attached to those eyes stood well over 6 feet tall, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his work shirt. He wore dusty chaps over his trousers and held his hat respectfully in his calloused hands. Despite the mud coating her dress, despite the humiliation burning in her cheeks, despite the fact that she looked like something the cat had dragged through a swamp, he smiled at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever laid eyes on. "You are the prettiest sight," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. She accepted his outstretched hand and let him pull her to her feet, very aware of how strong his grip was, how steady. "I must look absolutely dreadful," she managed to say, brushing uselessly at the mud caking the front of her green traveling dress. "I am Catherine Monroe from Boston. I have come to meet Mr. James Thornton." Something flickered across the cowboy's handsome face, something that looked almost like disappointment, but it vanished so quickly Catherine thought she might have imagined it. "I am James Thornton," he said quietly, "but folks around here just call me Thorn. Welcome to Salvation Creek, Miss Monroe. I apologize that your arrival was not more graceful, but I meant what I said. You are the prettiest thing I have seen in a long time." Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warm Texas sun beating down on them. For 6 months, she and James Thornton had corresponded through letters arranged by the matrimonial agency. His letters had been thoughtful and kind, full of descriptions of his ranch and the wide open spaces of Texas, but never once had she imagined he would look like this. She had pictured someone older, perhaps weathered and rough. The man before her could not have been more than 28 or 29, and despite the dust and hard work evident in his appearance, there was a gentleness in his eyes that made her heart flutter. "Your letters did not do you justice, Mr. Thornton," Catherine said, then immediately worried that sounded too forward. "That is, I mean, you write very well, and I simply did not expect." "You did not expect someone who looks like he just crawled out of a barn." Thorne smiled, and the expression transformed his already handsome face into something that made Catherine forget entirely about the mud on her dress. "You would not be wrong. I was checking on a mare about to foal when I got word the stage was coming in early. I rode hard to make sure I was here to meet you." He gathered her scattered belongings with an efficiency that spoke of a life lived outdoors, tucking her things back into her carpetbag with surprising care. When he picked up the small daguerreotype of her mother that had fallen into a puddle, he wiped it clean on his shirt before handing it to her. "This is precious, I reckon," he said. "Family." "My mother," Catherine replied, taking the photograph with trembling fingers. "She passed 2 years ago. I have no one left in Boston. That is part of why I answered your advertisement." Thorne's expression softened even further. "I am sorry for your loss. I lost my own parents when I was 18. Creek fever took them both within a week of each other. I understand what it means to be alone in the world." They stood there in the muddy street, the afternoon sun casting long shadows around them, and Catherine felt something shift inside her chest. This was not how she had imagined their first meeting. She had pictured herself stepping gracefully from the stage, looking her best, making a good impression on the man who might become her husband. Instead, she looked like a drowned rat, and yet James Thornton was looking at her like she was precious. "I have a room arranged for you at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house," Thorne said, gesturing down the street. "I thought you might want some time to settle in, get cleaned up before we talked about our arrangement. I know this is all strange for you, coming all this way to meet a man you have never seen before. You wrote that you needed a wife to help you keep your ranch," Catherine said as they began walking down the main street of Salvation Creek. The town was smaller than she had expected, just one long street lined with wooden buildings, but it had a general store, a church, a saloon, and what looked like a blacksmith shop. Mountains rose in the distance, purple and hazy in the afternoon light. "You said the bank would not extend your loan without proof of stability." "That is true," Thorne admitted, carrying her bag as they walked. "The banker, Mr. Hutchins, seems to think a bachelor is too much of a risk. He wants to see that I have a family, someone to help build a future. But Miss Monroe, I want you to know that I would never hold you to anything if you decide this is not what you want. I will pay for your return passage to Boston if you choose to leave." Catherine glanced at him from the corner of her eye. "You would do that, even though you paid for my passage here." "I would," Thorne said firmly. "I want a partner, Miss Monroe, not a prisoner. If we are going to make this work, it has to be because we both choose it." Mrs. Patterson's boarding house turned out to be a tidy two-story building, painted white with green shutters. The proprietress herself was a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and flour dusting her apron. She took one look at Catherine's muddy dress and clucked her tongue sympathetically. "You poor dear, what a journey you must have had. Come right upstairs and I will have hot water sent up for a bath. Mr. Thornton, you scat now and let the lady get herself sorted. You can come calling tomorrow at a proper hour." Thorne nodded, setting Catherine's bag down in the neat little room Mrs. Patterson showed them. "I will come by after breakfast if that suits you, Miss Monroe. We can talk then about expectations and such." "That would be fine," Catherine said, and when Thorne smiled at her one more time before leaving, she felt her heart do that strange, fluttering thing again. After he left, Mrs. Patterson helped Catherine out of her ruined dress and into a hot bath that eased the aches from 3 days of stagecoach travel. "That James Thornton is a good man," the older woman said as she bustled about, laying out fresh towels. "He has had a rough time of it, trying to keep that ranch going all on his own. His parents left him a good piece of land, but it takes more than one person to run a cattle operation. The bank has been breathing down his neck for 2 years now." "He seems very kind," Catherine ventured, sinking deeper into the warm water. "Kind does not even begin to cover it. Last winter, when the Johnsons lost their barn in a fire, Thorne was the first one there to help rebuild. He does not have much, but what he has, he shares. This town would be in sorry shape without him." Mrs. Patterson smiled knowingly. "And he is easy on the eyes, is he not? Half the unmarried women in 3 counties have tried to catch his attention, but he never seemed interested in any of them. Then one day he up and puts an advertisement in that matrimonial paper. Surprised us all." Catherine lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling of her small room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a Texas night. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The wind rattled the shutters. She thought about James Thornton's blue eyes and the way he had looked at her, covered in mud, and called her the prettiest sight. She thought about his gentle hands wiping the photograph clean, about his offer to send her home if she wanted to leave. In Boston, she had been engaged to Charles Worthington Roman III, a banker's son with soft hands and a calculating smile. When his family lost their fortune in a bad investment, Charles had broken their engagement without a second thought, leaving Catherine alone and nearly penniless. Her father's debts had taken everything. The matrimonial agency had seemed like the only way out, a chance to start over somewhere far from the whispers and pitying looks. She had expected necessity, not hope. She had expected obligation, not the possibility of something real. When Thorne arrived the next morning, Catherine was wearing her best day dress, a blue calico that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. She had pinned her auburn hair up neatly, and Mrs. Patterson had lent her a cameo brooch that added a touch of elegance to her collar. Thorne had cleaned up too, wearing a pressed shirt and dark trousers, his hair still damp from washing. He held a bouquet of wildflowers that he must have picked that morning. "These are for you," he said, offering them with an almost shy expression. "They grow all over the ranch this time of year. Not fancy like the flowers you probably had in Boston, but they are pretty in their own way." Catherine took the flowers, touched by the gesture. "They are beautiful, Mr. Thornton, thank you. I thought we could take a walk if you are feeling up to it. I would like to show you the ranch, let you see what you would be getting into if you decided to stay." They walked together through the morning sunshine, leaving the town behind. Thorne had brought a gentle mare for Catherine to ride, and he rode alongside her on a big bay gelding, pointing out landmarks as they went. His ranch lay about 3 miles outside of town, a spread of rolling grassland nestled against the foothills of the mountains. The ranch house itself was modest, a sturdy structure built of logs and stone, with a covered porch and a view that stretched for miles. "My father built this house the year before I was born," Thorne said as they stood on the porch, looking out over the land. "He always said this was the most beautiful spot in all of Texas." "I have never found reason to disagree with him." "It is breathtaking," Catherine said honestly. The sky seemed bigger here than it ever had in Boston, an endless expanse of blue unmarred by buildings or smoke. The wind carried the scent of grass and wildflowers. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing peacefully. "How much land do you have?" 2,000 acres, give or take. It is not the biggest ranch in Texas, but it is mine. Or it will be if I can convince the bank to extend my loan for another year. I need capital to buy more breeding stock, to fix up the barn and hire some hands for the roundup. Mr. Hutchins says he will consider it if I can prove I am settling down, building something permanent. Catherine turned to look at him. "So you need a wife as a business arrangement." Thorne met her gaze steadily. "That is what I told myself when I placed that advertisement, but Miss Monroe, I have to be honest with you. From the moment I saw you yesterday, covered in mud and looking like you wanted to murder that stagecoach driver, I felt something I did not expect to feel. My heart near about stopped when you looked up at me with those eyes of yours." Her breath caught. "Mr. Thornton, I know it is too soon to speak of such things," he continued quickly. "We have only just met, but I believe in honesty and I want you to know where I stand. Yes, I need a wife for the bank. But I find myself hoping that maybe, if you give us a chance, we could build something real here, something more than just a business arrangement." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. "I came here expecting duty," she said softly. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go, nothing else to hope for. But when you called me the prettiest sight, even though I looked dreadful, something in my heart woke up. Something I thought died when my mother passed." Thorne stepped closer, close enough that Catherine could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. "What do you say we start fresh, then? Not as strangers fulfilling an agreement, but as two people who might have found something unexpected. I will court you proper, Miss Monroe. I will show you what life could be like here. And if at the end of a month you decide this is not what you want, I will honor my word and send you back to Boston with enough money to start over there." 1 month, Catherine repeated. 1 month, Thorne confirmed. "That should give you time to get to know me, to get to know the town and the land, Time to decide if you could be happy here." Catherine looked out over the rolling grassland, at the mountains rising in the distance, at the sturdy house built by a father for his family. She thought about Boston with its narrow streets and narrower minds, about Charles and his cold rejection, about the empty future that had waited for her there. Then she looked at James Thornton, at the hope shining in his eyes, and made her decision. "I think 1 month sounds perfect," she said. The next weeks passed in a blur of new experiences and growing feelings. Thorne proved to be everything his letters had suggested and more. He showed Catherine every corner of the ranch, teaching her about cattle and horses, about reading the weather in the color of the sky, about the delicate balance of life on the frontier. He introduced her to his neighbors, good people who welcomed her warmly. The Johnsons, whose barn Thorne had helped rebuild, invited them both for dinner. Sarah Johnson, heavily pregnant with her 4th child, took Catherine aside and whispered, "That man looks at you like you hung the moon, dear. We have all been hoping he would find someone special." In town, Catherine began to find her place. She helped Mrs. Patterson in the boarding house kitchen, learning to cook the hearty meals that frontier life demanded. She attended Sunday services at the small church, where Reverend Walsh gave sermons about building community and helping your neighbor. She met the schoolteacher, Miss Emma Brooks, who confided that she was glad to have another educated woman in town to talk to. But it was the time alone with Thorne that Catherine treasured most. The evening rides when the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. The quiet conversations on the porch while the stars came out overhead. The way he always helped her down from her horse, his hands strong and steady on her waist. The way he listened when she talked about her mother, about the life she had left behind, about her fears and hopes for the future. 2 weeks into their month, they were riding back from checking on a herd in the far pasture when a spring storm rolled in suddenly, the way storms do in Texas. The sky darkened within minutes, and rain began to pour down in sheets. Thorne urged his horse into a gallop, leading Catherine toward an old line shack he used during roundups. They burst through the door just as lightning split the sky, both of them soaked to the skin and laughing breathlessly. "Some guide I am," Thorne said, shaking water from his hair like a dog. "Getting you caught in a storm your 3rd week in Texas." "It is exhilarating," Catherine said, peeling off her sodden jacket. "In Boston, we would just sit indoors and wait for rain to pass. Here, everything feels so alive, even the weather." Thorne got a fire going in the small potbelly stove while Catherine explored the one-room shack. It was sparse but clean, with a narrow bunk, a small table, and supplies for cowboys who might need to stay out with the herd. The rain drummed on the roof, and thunder rumbled in the distance. In the close quarters, with the fire beginning to warm the space, Catherine became acutely aware of how alone they were, how intimate this felt. "We should probably wait until the worst of it passes," Thorne said, not meeting her eyes. "I would not want to risk the horses on slick ground with lightning striking." "Of course," Catherine agreed, settling onto the edge of the bunk. She watched Thorne move around the small space, watched the way the firelight played across his features. 3 weeks ago he had been a stranger. Now, the thought of leaving at the end of her month made her chest ache. "Catherine," Thorne said suddenly, then stopped. He had never used her first name before, always careful to maintain proper decorum. "I am sorry, Miss Monroe, I should not have." "Catherine is fine," she said softly. "I would like it if you called me Catherine." He turned to face her, and the intensity in his eyes made her heart race. "Catherine," he said again, like he was tasting the word. "I know we agreed to a month, but I need you to know something. These past few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. When I wake up in the morning, my first thought is of you. When I am working the herd, I find myself thinking about things I want to show you, stories I want to tell you. You have become essential to me, like air, like water." Catherine stood, crossing the small space between them. "Thorn," she said, using the name everyone in Salvation Creek called him, the name that felt right on her tongue. "I feel the same way. I came here thinking I was running away from one life, but instead I found myself running toward another. Toward you." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. His palms were rough with calluses, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "I know I am supposed to wait, supposed to be a gentleman, but Catherine, may I kiss you?" In answer, Catherine rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative. But then Thorn's arms came around her and pulled her close, and Catherine felt like she was finally, truly home. She wound her arms around his neck, pressing closer, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "Marry me," Thorn said against her hair. "Not for the bank, not for the ranch. Marry me because I love you, Catherine Monroe. I love your strength and your courage. I love the way you laugh when the wind musses your hair. I love how you are not afraid of hard work or new things. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that coming to Texas was the best decision you ever made." Catherine pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "I love you too," she said, wonder in her voice. "I did not think I could feel this way, not after everything that happened in Boston, but you make me believe in happiness again. Yes, James Thornton. I will marry you." They kissed again, longer this time, deeper, until the storm outside seemed like nothing compared to the storm of feeling inside that small line shack. When they finally pulled apart, both flushed and grinning like fools, the rain had slowed to a gentle patter on the roof. "We should get back to town before it gets dark," Thorn said reluctantly. "I want to do this right, Catherine. I want to marry you in the church with the whole town watching. I want everyone to know that you chose me, that we chose each other." They rode back through the dripping landscape, the world washed clean by the storm. Mrs. Patterson took one look at their faces when they returned and burst into delighted laughter. "I knew it," she crowed. "I told Mr. Patterson just last night that you two were head over heels. When is the wedding?" "As soon as Reverend Walsh can arrange it," Thorn said, unable to stop smiling. "And as soon as Miss Monroe can get a proper dress made, I want her to have everything perfect." The next week was a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah Johnson, despite her advanced pregnancy, insisted on helping Catherine sew a wedding dress from cream-colored silk that had been her own mother's. The fabric was beautiful, and Sarah had been saving it for something special. "I would be honored if you wore this," she said, pressing the silk into Catherine's hands. "You are family now." Emma Brooks organized the ladies of the town to decorate the church with wildflowers and ribbons. Mrs. Patterson baked a 3-tiered cake that was the talk of Salvation Creek. Even Mr. Hutchins from the bank grudgingly admitted that Thorn had kept his end of the bargain and approved the loan extension, though Catherine noticed Thorn barely seemed to care any more. He had gotten something far more valuable than bank approval. The night before the wedding, Catherine stayed at the boarding house while Thorn remained at the ranch. It was considered bad luck for the groom to see the bride, and despite their modern circumstances, they both found themselves wanting to honor the old traditions. Catherine lay awake, thinking about how much her life had changed in 1 month. She had arrived in Salvation Creek expecting nothing, and tomorrow she would marry the man she loved, the man who had looked at her covered in mud and seen something beautiful. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with a breeze that carried the scent of spring flowers. Catherine dressed carefully in the silk gown that fit her perfectly, thanks to Sarah's skilled hands. Mrs. Patterson arranged her auburn hair in an elegant style, weaving tiny white flowers through the curls. When Catherine looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a different woman than the one who had tumbled out of that stagecoach. She saw someone happy, someone hopeful, someone loved. The church was packed when Catherine arrived. It seemed like the entire town had turned out to witness James Thornton finally tie the knot. Emma Brooks played a lovely melody on the old piano as Catherine walked down the aisle, and when she saw Thorne waiting for her at the altar, she thought her heart might burst from happiness. He wore a black suit that made his blue eyes even more striking, and the look on his face when he saw her made tears spring to her eyes. Reverend Walsh performed the ceremony with warmth and humor, speaking about love and partnership, about building a life together through good times and hard. When it came time for the vows, Thorne took Catherine's hands in his and spoke in a voice that carried through the small church. "Catherine, I promise to love you every day of my life. I promise to be your partner in all things, to honor your strength and your independence. I promise to make you laugh when times are hard, to hold you when you need comfort, and to thank God every night that you came to Texas and gave me a chance." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face as she spoke her own vows. "Thorne, I promise to stand beside you, to build a life with you here in this place that has become home. I promise to love you with my whole heart, to be your companion and your friend. I came here lost, and you helped me find myself again. That is a gift I can never repay, but I will spend my life trying." When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, Thorne kissed Catherine like she was the most precious thing in the world, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. They walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, Mr. and Mrs. James Thornton, and Catherine knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The reception was held in the town square, with tables laden with food and a fiddle band that played lively music. Catherine danced with her new husband, whirling around under the Texas sky, surrounded by the community that had welcomed her so warmly. Sarah Johnson, now past her due date and looking ready to pop at any moment, pulled Catherine into a careful hug. "Welcome to the family, sister," she said warmly. As the sun began to set, Thorne swept Catherine up onto his horse, and they rode away from the celebration toward their ranch, toward their home. The house had been cleaned and prepared, with flowers in jars on every surface and the bed made up with a beautiful quilt that Mrs. Patterson had given them as a wedding gift. That night, as Catherine lay in her husband's arms in the home they would share, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The heartbreak in Boston, the fear of the unknown, the muddy arrival that had ended with Thorne calling her the prettiest sight. Every stumble, every difficulty had led her to this moment, to this man, to this life. "What are you thinking about?" Thorne murmured against her hair. "That I would go through it all again," Catherine said softly. "Every hardship, every fear, every moment of uncertainty if it meant ending up here with you." Thorne kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me," he promised. "I could never regret you," Catherine said. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." The first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning to share space and decisions, learning the rhythms of each other's days. Catherine threw herself into life on the ranch with enthusiasm. She learned to cook the meals Thorne loved, mastering biscuits and stew and roast chicken. She helped with the horses, discovering she had a natural talent for gentling the skittish ones. She kept the books for the ranch, her education in Boston finally finding practical use as she tracked expenses and income, finding ways to stretch their resources further. Thorne, for his part, proved to be everything Catherine could have hoped for in a husband. He valued her opinions and asked for her input on ranch decisions. He never made her feel less than his equal, even when teaching her about aspects of ranch life she did not yet understand. He made her laugh every single day, whether with silly jokes or playful teasing. And at night, he showed her what it meant to be truly loved, to be cherished, to be desired. Summer came hot and intense, and Catherine learned what it meant to live through a Texas heat wave. She and Thorne rose before dawn to work during the cooler hours, then spent the hottest part of the afternoon in the shade of the porch, planning and dreaming. They talked about building onto the house, about buying more cattle now that the bank had extended the loan, about the future they were creating together. In August, Sarah Johnson finally had her baby, a healthy boy she named Thomas. Catherine helped care for Sarah during her recovery, and holding that tiny infant stirred something deep inside her. She began to imagine what it would be like to have a child with Thorne, to see his blue eyes looking out from a baby's face. By October, Catherine's suspicions were confirmed when Doc Harrison examined her and declared her about 10 weeks along. She had wanted to be sure before telling Thorne, had wanted to have it confirmed by someone who knew. The doctor smiled at her obvious joy. "That husband of yours is going to be over the moon," he said kindly. Catherine planned carefully how to tell Thorne. She waited until they were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun set over the mountains in shades of orange and gold. The air had finally cooled with the arrival of autumn, and Thorne had his arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "I have news," Catherine said, unable to keep the smile from her voice. Thorne looked down at her, immediately alert. "Good news." "The best news," Catherine confirmed. "We are going to have a baby. Doc Harrison says sometime in late April or early May." For a moment, Thorne just stared at her, and Catherine felt a flutter of worry. Then his face split into the biggest grin she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop that probably echoed all the way to town. He picked Catherine up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully, looking stricken. "I am sorry, I should not have done that. Are you well? Should you be sitting?" "Do you need anything?" Catherine laughed, the sound full of joy. "I am perfectly fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Thorne. I am not fragile." "You are carrying our child," Thorne said, wonder in his voice. He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby, Catherine, I cannot believe it. I am going to be a father." "And you are going to be wonderful at it," Catherine assured him, covering his hand with her own. That winter was mild by Texas standards, and Catherine bloomed with her pregnancy. Her body changed, her belly growing round, and Thorne treated her like she was made of spun glass despite her protests. He hired 2 ranch hands to help with the heavy work, refusing to let Catherine do anything strenuous. He rubbed her swollen feet at night and brought her breakfast in bed, even though she told him repeatedly that she was perfectly capable of getting up. The town rallied around them as they always did. Mrs. Patterson knitted tiny blankets and booties. Sarah Johnson shared her wisdom about childbirth and caring for newborns. Emma Brooks organized a quilting bee where the ladies made a beautiful baby quilt in shades of yellow and green. As Catherine's due date approached, Thorne grew increasingly nervous. He checked and rechecked the supplies Doc Harrison said they would need. He made sure the bedroom was spotless and comfortable. He drove Catherine crazy with his hovering until she finally sat him down and made him take a breath. "Thorne," she said gently, taking his face in her hands, "I am scared too. But we will get through this together, just like we have gotten through everything else. I am strong, and Doc Harrison knows what he is doing. Our baby is going to be fine, and so am I." "I cannot lose you," Thorne said roughly. "Catherine, you are everything to me. If something happened to you—" "Nothing is going to happen to me," Catherine said firmly. "I am going to have this baby, and then you and I are going to raise him or her together for the next 50 years. That is how this story goes." Labor started on a warm evening in late April, just as the sun was setting. Catherine felt the first contraction while she was making supper, a tightening across her belly that took her breath away. By the time Thorne rode into town to fetch Doc Harrison, the pains were coming regularly, each one stronger than the last. Mrs. Patterson arrived with the doctor, taking charge of the situation with the confidence of a woman who had helped deliver dozens of babies. Sarah Johnson came too, despite having her own 4 children to look after. She held Catherine's hand through the contractions, speaking in a low, soothing voice, telling her when to breathe, when to push, when to rest. Thorne paced outside the bedroom door, prevented from entering by Mrs. Patterson's firm decree that men had no business in a birthing room. He could hear Catherine's cries of pain, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. The hours stretched endlessly, night deepening and then beginning to lighten toward dawn. Just as the first rays of sun broke over the horizon, a new sound filled the house. The sharp, angry cry of a newborn baby. Thorne's knees nearly buckled with relief. A moment later, Doc Harrison opened the door, looking tired but happy. "Congratulations, Thorne, you have a son, a healthy, strong boy with good lungs, and your wife is doing just fine. Come and meet your family." Thorne entered the bedroom on shaking legs. Catherine lay propped against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms, she held a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Mrs. Patterson's knitted blankets. When she looked up at Thorne, her eyes were full of tears and joy. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Thorne sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the impossibly small person in his wife's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that, while currently the indeterminate blue of all newborns, seemed to look right at his father with serious intensity. Thorne reached out with one finger and the baby grasped it with a tiny fist, holding on with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Thorne said, his voice rough with emotion. "Catherine, you are amazing. You did this. You brought our son into the world." "We did this," Catherine corrected, looking up at him with all the love in her heart shining in her eyes. "Together." "What should we name him?" They had discussed names over the winter, but now that the baby was here, real and breathing and holding onto his father's finger, Thorne found himself thinking of the man who had built this house, who had chosen this land, who had given Thorne the foundation for the life he was now living. "What about John?" he suggested. "After my father, John Thornton, it is a strong name." "John," Catherine repeated, testing it out. She smiled down at the baby. "Hello, John." "Welcome to the world, little one. We have been waiting for you." The first weeks with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. John was a good baby, healthy and growing, but he demanded constant attention. Catherine fed him every few hours, day and night, and Thorne did everything else, cooking and cleaning and caring for Catherine while she recovered from childbirth. They worked as a team, just as they always had, supporting each other through the difficult moments and celebrating every tiny milestone. When John was 6 weeks old, they brought him to church for the first time, and Reverend Walsh performed a small blessing ceremony. The whole town came to see the newest member of the Thornton family, and the reception afterward turned into an impromptu celebration. Catherine stood with her husband and son, surrounded by the community they had built, and felt a deep sense of contentment. This was home. These were her people. This was the life she had found when she had stumbled off that stagecoach covered in mud. As John grew from a baby into a toddler, the ranch prospered. With the bank loan secured and Thorne's hard work, they were able to expand the herd and hire more hands. Catherine's careful bookkeeping meant they always knew exactly where they stood financially, and her suggestions for improving efficiency proved invaluable. They were partners in every sense of the word, building something lasting together. When John was 2 years old, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, Thorne took the news with more composure, though he still fussed over her endlessly. Their daughter, Elizabeth, arrived on a cool October morning, and she was the image of her mother with auburn hair and hazel eyes. John, now old enough to understand he had a baby sister, was fascinated by her, always wanting to help feed her or bring her toys. The years flowed by like water, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The ranch continued to grow, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. Thorne's reputation as a fair employer and skilled rancher spread, and he was eventually elected to the town council, helping to make decisions that shaped Salvation Creek's future. Catherine became an integral part of the community in her own right. She started a lending library in the church basement, donating books from Boston and encouraging others to contribute. She helped Emma Brooks with the school when the teacher's health began to fail, eventually taking over some of the older students' lessons. She was there when Sarah Johnson's husband died unexpectedly, helping the widow manage her farm and care for her children. Through it all, through the good years and the hard ones, through times of plenty and times of drought, Catherine and Thorne's love deepened. They grew into each other, learning each other's rhythms so well they could communicate with just a look. They faced challenges together, from sick cattle to harsh winters to the normal trials of raising children, and every obstacle they overcame made them stronger. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thorne took Catherine back to the spot where they had sheltered from that spring storm, to the line shack where he had first kissed her, and told her he loved her. He had arranged for the children to stay with Mrs. Patterson for the night, and he had prepared a special supper to share in that small, significant space. "Do you remember?" he asked as they sat together on the narrow bunk, the same potbelly stove warming the same small room. "Every moment," Catherine said, leaning against his shoulder. "I remember thinking my heart would burst from happiness. I remember feeling like I had finally found where I belonged. I knew that day that I would love you for the rest of my life," Thorne said, wrapping his arm around her. "And every day since has only proved it true. You are still the prettiest sight I have ever seen, Catherine Thornton, even prettier than that day you arrived covered in mud." Catherine laughed, the sound warm and full of joy. "And you are still the best decision I ever made. Coming to Texas, taking a chance on a stranger who turned out to be the love of my life. I would not change a single moment." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the wind outside, holding each other close. 10 years of marriage, 2 beautiful children, a successful ranch, a community they loved. It was more than Catherine had ever dreamed possible that day she stepped off the stagecoach. "What are you thinking about?" Thorne asked eventually, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding night. "I am thinking about everything we have built," Catherine said. "Not just the ranch or the house, but our life together. Our family. I am thinking about how lucky I am, how blessed we are." "The luck was all mine," Thorne said, tilting her face up to kiss her gently. "You chose me, Catherine. Out of all the places you could have gone, all the men you could have answered, you chose my advertisement. You came to Salvation Creek and you chose me." "And I would choose you again," Catherine said firmly. "Every single time in every possible world I would choose you." As they rode home the next morning to their children and their ranch and their life, Catherine found herself thinking about the scared, heartbroken woman who had climbed onto that stagecoach in Boston 10 years ago. That woman had been running away from pain, from disappointment, from a future that held nothing but emptiness. She had expected, at best, a tolerable arrangement with a stranger who needed a wife for practical reasons. Instead, she had found love. Real, deep, lasting love with a man who saw beauty in her even when she was covered in mud, who valued her mind as much as her heart, who made her laugh and supported her dreams and gave her a home in every sense of the word. She had found a community that welcomed her, children who filled her heart with joy, a purpose that went beyond mere survival. The years continued to pass, bringing their own rhythms and seasons. John grew into a thoughtful young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did, learning everything Thorn could teach him about cattle and horses and the land. Elizabeth inherited her mother's love of learning, devouring every book in Catherine's lending library and dreaming of becoming a teacher like Miss Brooks had been. When John was 15 and Elizabeth 13, Catherine gave birth one more time, surprising both herself and Thorn. They had thought their family was complete, but little Sarah arrived like a gift, bringing new energy and joy into their home. John and Elizabeth doted on their baby sister, and watching Thorn with his youngest daughter, seeing the gentleness with which he held her and the love that shone in his eyes, made Catherine fall in love with him all over again. The town of Salvation Creek grew and changed too. The railroad finally came through, bringing new prosperity and new people. The main street expanded, adding more shops and businesses. Mrs. Patterson eventually retired, turning her boarding house over to a young couple from Kansas. Reverend Walsh passed away peacefully in his sleep and was replaced by a younger minister with modern ideas. Sarah Johnson saw all her children grown and married, and she and Catherine remained close friends, their bond forged through those early years supporting each other. Through all the changes, the Thornton Ranch remained a constant, a symbol of what hard work and love could build. Thorn's reputation as a fair and honest rancher meant he was respected throughout the region. Catherine's work with the lending library and the school meant she was beloved by families who valued education and culture even on the frontier. On their 20th anniversary, their children threw them a party that brought together everyone from miles around. The barn had been cleaned and decorated, tables laden with food, and a proper band hired from San Antonio. Catherine wore a new dress in blue silk, and Thorn wore his best suit, and as they danced together under the lantern light, Catherine thought about how far they had come. 20 years, she said, smiling up at her husband. We have been married for 20 years, Thorn. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like I have known you my whole life. The best 20 years a man could ask for, Thorn replied, spinning her gently. His hair was touched with gray now at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But to Catherine, he was just as handsome as he had been that first day. Here is to 20 more, my love, and 20 after that. John, now a man of 22 with his own plans to expand the ranch's breeding program, raised a glass in toast. To my parents, who taught me what real love looks like, who showed me that partnership and respect are the foundation of a strong marriage, may we all be as blessed as they have been. Elizabeth, at 20, home from the teaching position she had taken in a neighboring town, added her own toast. To the woman who came from Boston and became the heart of our community, and to the man wise enough to see her beauty even covered in mud. Thank you for showing me that women can be strong and educated and still be deeply loved. Little Sarah, now 5 years old, simply climbed onto her father's lap and announced, I love you, Papa and Mama, which brought tears to Catherine's eyes and laughter from everyone present. As the party continued around them, Thorn pulled Catherine out onto the porch of the barn, where they could have a moment of quiet. The stars overhead were brilliant, as they always were in the clear Texas sky, and the sounds of celebration drifted out behind them. I need to tell you something, Thorn said, taking both of Catherine's hands in his, something I have thought many times but never quite found the words to say properly. What is it? Catherine asked, seeing the serious expression on his face. That day you arrived, covered in mud and looking ready to cry, I said you were the prettiest sight I had ever seen, and you were. But Catherine, you become more beautiful to me every single day. Not just your face, though you are still the most lovely woman I have ever known, but your spirit, your strength. The way you face every challenge with grace, the way you love our children, the way you make everyone around you feel valued and seen. You are the best person I have ever known, and I thank God every day that you chose to stay." Catherine felt tears streaming down her face, happy tears that came from a heart so full it overflowed. "Oh, Thorn, you make it sound like I did something special by staying, but how could I have left? You showed me what love really is, not just romance, though we have that, but partnership, respect. The daily choice to honor and cherish another person. You gave me a home, not just a house, but a place where I belong completely." They kissed there in the starlight, 20 years of love and partnership in that one embrace. And from inside the barn, their children and friends cheered, knowing that this love story was the real thing, the kind that lasted forever. As the years advanced, and their children grew into adults with families of their own, Catherine and Thorn settled into the peaceful rhythm of grandparents. John married a rancher's daughter from the next county, and they took over running the day-to-day operations of the Thornton Ranch, while Thorn served as advisor and mentor. Elizabeth married the new doctor who came to replace Doc Harrison, and they had 3 children who loved spending summers with their grandparents. Even young Sarah grew up, becoming a teacher like her sister, though she always said she would never leave Texas the way Catherine had left Boston all those years ago. On their 30th anniversary, Thorn and Catherine took a trip back to the line shack one more time, a tradition they had maintained over the years. Thorn had maintained the little building carefully, and it had become a private sanctuary for them, a place to remember and reconnect. 30 years, Catherine said, sitting beside her husband on the porch of the shack, looking out over land that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. "We have lived a whole life together, Thorn. We have raised 3 wonderful children, built a successful ranch, contributed to our community. We have seen so much. And I would not change a single moment," Thorn said, his hand finding hers automatically, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. "Well, perhaps I would change the part where John broke his arm falling out of that tree, and the year the drought nearly ruined us. And that time Elizabeth got so sick with fever we thought we would lose her," Catherine laughed. "So you would change quite a bit then." "No," Thorn said seriously, turning to look at her. "Because even those hard moments, those scary times, they made us who we are. They made our family stronger. And they taught our children that life is not always easy, but with love and determination, you can weather any storm." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who had grown so intertwined that words were often unnecessary. Catherine thought about the letter she had found recently, tucked away in an old trunk. The letter she had written to the matrimonial agency all those years ago, explaining her situation and requesting information about potential husbands. She had read it with eyes that barely recognized the desperate, frightened woman who had penned those words. "I was so scared," she said aloud. "When I wrote to that agency, when I agreed to come to Texas. I was terrified that I was making a terrible mistake, that I would end up trapped in a loveless marriage with a cruel man, that I would regret it for the rest of my life." "And do you?" Thorn asked softly. "Regret it?" Catherine turned to face him fully, cupping his weathered face in her hands. "Not for one single second. You gave me everything, Thorn. A home, a family, a purpose, a community. But most of all, you gave me love. Real, true, lasting love. You saw me, really saw me from that very first moment, and you never stopped seeing me." "How could I?" Thorn replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the prettiest sight I have ever seen. You always will be." They kissed then, the kiss of 2 people who had loved each other for 3 decades, who had built a life together through joy and sorrow, who knew each other's hearts as well as their own. And as the sun set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold and pink, Catherine felt a profound sense of peace. This was her life, the life she had chosen, the life she had built with the man she loved. And it was beautiful. More years passed, bringing the usual mix of happiness and heartache. Thorn's health began to decline when he was in his late 60s, his body finally giving in after a lifetime of hard physical work. Catherine nursed him through illness and injury, just as he had cared for her during her pregnancies and through the various ailments that come with age. They grew old together, their hair turning white, their steps slowing, but their love never diminishing. John and his wife now ran the ranch completely, having expanded it into one of the most successful operations in Texas. Elizabeth and her doctor husband were pillars of the Salvation Creek community, raising their children with the same values Catherine and Thorn had instilled. Sarah traveled throughout Texas teaching, but she always came home to visit, bringing stories and laughter and new books for her mother's library. On a warm spring evening, when Catherine was 71 and Thorn 73, they sat together on the porch of the ranch house Thorn's father had built so long ago. Wildflowers dotted the landscape, just as they had that first spring when Thorn had picked Catherine a bouquet. In the distance, they could see John working with the horses, could hear the laughter of grandchildren playing in the yard. "We did well, did we not?" Thorn said, his hand covering Catherine's where it rested on the arm of her rocking chair. His grip was not as strong as it once had been, but it was just as loving. "We did better than well," Catherine replied, squeezing his fingers gently. "We built something lasting, Thorn, not just the ranch, though that will continue for generations, but love. Real love that our children and grandchildren can see and hopefully find for themselves." "Tell me again," Thorn said, a familiar request. "Tell me about the day you arrived." Catherine smiled, having told this story countless times to children and grandchildren, but never tiring of it. "I fell out of that stagecoach and landed in the mud, looking absolutely dreadful. I was ready to get right back on that stage and return to Boston. But then I looked up, and there was this handsome cowboy with the bluest eyes I had ever seen, looking at me like I was something precious." "You were precious," Thorn interjected. "You are precious. And even though I was covered in mud, even though I looked like something the cat dragged in, you said," Catherine prompted. "I said you were the prettiest sight I had ever seen," Thorn finished, his voice soft with memory. "And I meant it then, and I mean it now. You are still the prettiest sight, Catherine Thornton. And loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life." Catherine leaned over carefully and kissed her husband's weathered cheek. "And you, James Thornton, have been my miracle. You took a scared woman with nothing and gave her everything. You loved me when I did not think I could be loved again. You built a life with me that exceeded my wildest dreams." They sat together as the sun set, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a love that would be remembered and celebrated for generations. Their children would tell their grandchildren about the mail-order bride who arrived in Salvation Creek, covered in mud, and the cowboy who saw past the mud to the woman beneath. They would tell about the love that grew from that inauspicious beginning, the partnership that built an empire, the devotion that lasted a lifetime. As darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, Catherine and Thorn remained on the porch, holding hands, surrounded by the life they had created together. And if someone had asked Catherine in that moment if she regretted stepping off that stagecoach all those years ago, if she regretted taking a chance on a stranger in a strange land, she would have laughed and said no. Because that muddy arrival had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of her life, the start of a love story that would last forever. Years later, when grandchildren asked about their love, the answer was always simple. True love sees beyond the surface to the heart beneath. It builds rather than takes. It grows stronger with time rather than fading. And sometimes, it begins with a muddy dress and a cowboy who knows beauty when he sees it. That was the legacy Catherine and Thorn left behind. Not just land and cattle and buildings, but the enduring example of what real love looks like, what it requires, and what it can create when two people commit to building a life together. Their story became legend in Salvation Creek, passed down through generations as proof that love can bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, that courage and faith can lead to happiness, and that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a risk on the unknown. And somewhere in heaven, a mail-order bride and her cowboy were surely still holding hands, still looking at each other like they were the prettiest sight in all creation, their love eternal and unchanging, just as it had always been from that very first muddy meeting in the spring of 1876.